All right, so let's see, where are we? I think we're right about on the dot, just a little bit after. So
Okay.
add one more person in here. And all right, so hello, everyone. Thank you for coming along and joining us tonight. I assume since you registered for our event, you must know who Joe Lansdale is, but just in case, I'm going to give him a little introduction anyways. Joe R. Lansdale is the internationally known best-selling author of more than 40 novels, including over a dozen in the Hap and Leonard series, which was beloved by his fans even before it was adapted for TV. He's won the Edgar Award, and that was for my personal Lansdale favorite, The Bottoms. He's won 10 Stoker Awards and more. He's firmly rooted in East Texas, and he is, in my opinion, one of this country's finest storytellers. I've been singing his praises for years, and since Hap and Leonard was first broadcast, it's been really exciting to see other folks catching up and getting on the Lansdale bandwagon. So finally,
right. The train.
Yes, the Lansdale train. So tonight we're here to celebrate last month's release of Born for Trouble, which collects some really excellent Hap and Leonard stories that were written at times when Joe was working on other projects and found himself missing the boys. So lucky for us, he writes these visits down so that we can get a kick out of them too. And it is a high octane kick. So Joe, I feel very lucky that I was able to bring you and your wife Karen up here to Portland, Maine back in 2015, 7 years ago, for a screening of Christmas with the Dead. And it's been a long time.
Which my son wrote.
Yeah.
Yeah, my son wrote, who was here a while ago. Right. He just left.
Yes,
well, he's
you guys missed him.
Actually, but he wrote that script.
You guys
based on my story.
Make a good team. So it's been a long time since we've talked. And how have you been?
I have been really good. I mean, probably like a lot of people, I'm ready for all of these things to open up a little bit more, and they're starting to, and that's good. But I've been traveling so much that it was almost like, as bad as it was, and not to undermine anybody else's struggles, but for me it was kind of like a holiday, and to some extent, because I've been traveling so much, I needed to slow down. Now that I've slowed down, I don't know that I have a gear to go back.
Yeah, I think it's changed everybody's pace.
Yeah, I've been getting out a little bit and doing some book signings, and we're supposed to go to Italy next month if all holds well. So
and they really like you over there, right?
Yeah, boy, do they. But everything's been well. Yeah, been good.
Excellent. Good. So I guess we can start right in. Over the past few weeks, I've been cobbling together some questions, things that have occurred to me. I have at least one question that was asked to me by one of my customers that's attending too. So, and I'd like to encourage everybody in the talk that if you do have questions for Joe, please add them to the chat. And once we finish up with our little interview, I will do everybody else's questions as well. So please feel free to use the little chat at the bottom of your screen to add in your questions anytime. So some of the things that I enjoy the most about Hap and Leonard stories are the moments where you suddenly feel like you're in a comic book, or you would if you weren't totally immersed in the story. But because I'm right in the middle of it, I, as the reader, I don't bat an eye. It just is, Yeah. So do you ever, long after writing these stories down, find yourself rereading them and laughing at the outrageous things that Hap and Leonard do?
Once I finish them, I don't find myself rereading them much, but I enjoy them so much when I'm writing them. And of course, I'm having to, because I do all my polishing as I go, but I reread those parts to make sure they sound good to me, and I get humored by them, and then I'm a little embarrassed that I'm laughing at my own characters. But I have a pretty good time with Hap and Leonard, and I miss them when I'm not writing about them, and but I'm sometimes glad to let them take a vacation, But yeah, I do laugh at it. myself, you know.
And then do actually in one of the stories in Born for Trouble, which we're very excited to have out on the sales tables now, is they do try to go on vacation. It doesn't go very well.
No, it never does. No, their vacations don't turn out well. They turn out better than mine, but mine don't always turn out well either. Ours are more like the Griswolds.
Oh no. So have you ever written something and then later trimmed it out thinking, nah, nobody's going to believe that?
Well, a lot of my stuff, not all of it, but a lot of my stuff deliberately walks the line. You know, it's somewhere between fable, somewhere between tall tale mythology and real life. And it's bigger than life, but yet it has that grounded feel throughout it. And so, you know, you never know, but I've said this before and probably ad nauseum, but my belief is that you write like everybody you know is dead. You don't ever write for anybody else other than you. Everybody else is dead when you write, because you don't want to think about somebody looking over your shoulder or what your editor expects or what your agent expects. You know, I don't do that. When I get through, of course, I hope people like it. So it's not a disregard that you don't care about the audience, but it's a belief of mine that if I can entertain me first, I'm more likely to entertain the audience, because I can't guess what all these different people want and all these different tastes, you know. So I have to say, you know, I got to do it for myself, you know. It's like that Ricky Nelson song, The Garden Party, you know. You can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself.
Yeah, it's a good place to start. And then,
Right.
you know, everybody else just follows along. And yeah, it's a wonderful, I think it's a great way to do it, because I mean, clearly
Works for me.
it has
It's
worked
the
for
only way
you.
I can do it.
Yeah.
I think there are some writers that are more tuned in to the audiences. You know, they can kind of catch. There's no way you know what everybody wants, but there are some people, I think, and I'm not one of them, that have a knack to sort of catch what the mainstream wants. But I'm not really that author, and my work is mainstream-ish, but not at the same time. In the same way that you have the fabulistic thing with the roots, that's the way my work is, and it's. You know, I never know who it's going to appeal to, and I have to do that.
Yeah. So in an interesting NPR interview I read that you did with a fellow several years ago, you talked about reading comic books as a kid. And,
Yes.
you know, like I said, a lot of the Hap and Leonard stories have that fabulous feel to them.
Right.
Are there any comic books that you read yourself these days? Or is that just something? Yeah.
Sure. I tend to read a lot of archives, you know, and some of the old archives are for nostalgia, because some of the dialogue and storylines are pretty silly in many ways. But there's something about those when I look at them, and they really bring a lot to me, you know. But that doesn't mean I just read older comics. I used to read a lot of superhero stuff when I was a kid, of course. But now and again, I like to look at it a little bit differently, you know. And though nothing has particularly jumped out at me lately, I still enjoy comics.
Are there any that you remember with particular enthusiasm from when you were a kid?
Yeah, I always loved Batman for the you know, the superhero comics, as you call them. That was a favorite of mine, and all the DC comics were favorites of mine. And I watched some of the DC shows, though most of them all dissolve into the same thing after 2-4 episodes or seasons. I mean, but I enjoy it. You know, I've never been secretive about that, and I feel like that without discovering comics, I wouldn't have become a writer, because I wanted to draw and write them. And I always told people that when I was 4, they decided I must be a genius artist. And when I was 6, I was still that artist. And when I was 30, I was no better. So it turned out I wasn't a genius artist at all. I was just pretty good at the moment. And, but my storytelling got better, you know? And so I think that that's what I was more designed for, was story. And that's what I loved the most. And, you know, I was influenced by many things. I was also influenced by movies and by all the movies that were showing on TV then, because I'm old enough that TV was relatively new. It was only a few years old. And so they were beginning to, not only creating shows for TV, but they were bringing a lot of the old radio show characters to TV. Gunsmoke comes to mind, but that's just one of many. And they were also showing all these old movies like Tarzan with Johnny Weissmuller, and then other versions of Tarzan, and all these different things. And I was just so excited by this unique world. And at that time, living in East Texas, it didn't seem to offer me much. Now, as I've grown older, I feel a little different about it. I enjoy it and look at it differently. But I have to say, comics is what I owe my first, introduction to storytelling to. And then that led to me reading classics. Illustrated comics led to me reading short stories and novels and things like that. So without them, I wouldn't have discovered the other. So I'm a big lover of comics. I love them very much.
It explains a lot, because when you're reading, when those of us who read your stories read them, we can see exactly what's going on in them. So I think probably your early experience with visual storytelling and your interest in it translates to the stories and makes them, it's a very physical thing to read, especially a Hap and Leonard story, or something like The Drive-In. There's a very visceral feel to it.
Right. Well, all those different things. I mean, certainly books and stories were, in the long run, were the greatest influences and contributions. But the original comics and films and radio shows and I would even say art and music and all of those things. I think that's true of nearly every writer. All of those things contribute to how you see things. And I've always liked a somewhat cinematic style. But also one thing that is also a big influence is storytellers. When I grew up in East Texas, it's essentially the South. It's not like the rest of Texas. It's very Southern. It's got lots of foliage, big trees. And I mean, I can see the tops of trees out here all along, having to look up, and I'm on the top floor of my house. And so, we have lots of trees, lots of water, snakes, alligators. It's more like Louisiana than it is like, Central or West Texas.
Yeah.
So the Southern storytelling tradition was here when I was growing up with my parents. And my parents were older when I was born. My dad was 42 when I was born. He was born in 1909. And you think about that, and I've said this before, but I'm always constantly amazed. When my dad was born, Mark Twain was alive. He died the year later. And then you think Annie Oakley was alive. Wyatt Earp was alive. Yeah. Buffalo
Legends.
Bill was alive. Bat Masterson was alive. And all of these people were alive. So my father's tradition growing up were stories about them from his parents. And his mother died when he was 8. My dad didn't have an education. He couldn't read or write. He learned to read a little bit and write his name. And that was about it. But from the 1900s, his people fought in the Civil War. That's how close that was. So the stories that came to me through him, and my mother was born in 1914, but so the stories that came to me through them were of the Great Depression, the 1930s, and prior to that, and the stories they had heard from the 1800s and stuff. So I think that storytelling tradition was there. And my grandmother came to Texas in a covered wagon. She saw Buffalo Bill's Wild West show when she was a girl, which she remembered to her dying day. She died at nearly 100 years old, and so she saw not only Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and came to Texas in a covered wagon, she saw men land on the moon. And she told me Scotch Irish ghost stories, things like that. So all of that stuff, it contributed, and it just sort of, and I think I was just the right person at the right time to integrate all of those things, and I didn't know, no one ever taught me, well, this is what literature is and this is what genre is. I was just attracted to story.
Yeah.
And I learned more about literary style and characterization and stuff like that as time went on. But I never lost those roots of genre being the engine that drives, a majority of my work.
Yeah. And I know you've also talked, I think in the NPR interview from a few years ago about, your father taking you aside and teaching you that if you start to enjoy seeing something fall or die, like when you're out hunting or shooting, you need to sit down and have a really serious talk with yourself. So
absolutely.
And
Yeah, I
I
do
feel,
remember that.
yeah, and Hap and Leonard,
Very much so.
a lot of their back and forth
Yeah,
seems to be about that issue.
right.
So I
Very,
know,
very much so.
yeah, and Hap seems to always try to be working out how, especially in the stories in Born for Trouble, he's trying to work around Leonard's somewhat freer attitude towards a lethal force. And I don't, maybe you could talk a little bit about what generates that difference between them.
Well, it generates a difference, but at some point they're both the same. Is that Hap, though, for all of his rhetoric and intent, can be a very violent person, but he doesn't want to be.
Yeah.
And when I was growing up, we hunted and fished because that's how you ate. That was part of how we ate. We were poor, but a lot of people then did. And when I didn't have to hunt for food, I didn't. I mean, you're still killing something, but at least I didn't have to go out and shoot it myself. But my father, like he said, he told me, he was teaching me how to hunt, and I learned how, but he always told me, he said, it's not a sport. He said, they can't shoot back. And when you start looking at watching them fall and enjoying watching them fall, you need to sit down on a log and talk to yourself. He said, you're killing for food. And it was the same way with fishing. You fish for food. And so that did have an impact on me. And I think of Hap being somewhat in that vein, is that, he's not wanting to get pleasure from killing, but he's deadly, and there's a place in him that's angry. And I think it has to do with disappointment in, he's very much a 60s kind of guy, just like me. I was anti-war and pro-civil rights, all those things. And he's still that. But there's that dark, angry streak in him, which I too had, for a long time. Fortunately, not to the extent that Hap has it in the books, but I understand it. When I write about it, it comes from a real place, being poor, being angry, and you grow up believing that your country's one thing. And I love this country, so I don't want to misjudge that, but it's not the Lone Ranger shoots the gun out of your hand, and it's not like the code of Batman and Superman back when I was growing up. See, I believed all those things, and still at heart, I wish to believe them. I'm an idealist, really. And I think what Hap is that he's a wounded idealist, and he is a angry idealist. And because he's disappointed that humans and himself cannot rise to the level that he would like to, the more positive level. So there are things like that. And Leonard, I think Leonard he's not somebody that enjoys killing, but he just thinks if it's got to be done, I'll do it. I don't care. He's not going to feel bad about it later. And I've known people like that as well. But at heart, they both have they have the best of intentions that often go wrong, And so, I mean, that's the thing. They're heroic, but I wouldn't honestly say that they're heroes, because they fail a lot, and they sometimes get in situations that they probably shouldn't have. But that's what makes the book. That's what makes the story.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things that I always appreciate about your stories is the way you write about human nature, which goes right in line with what we've been talking about. Your narrators are always observing the behavior of the people around them, and it gives the readers a window into our world pretty directly.
I try.
And while there might be some quite definite villains in your books, most of the cast of characters comes in myriad variations. So, and some of them are quite surprising. So when you're writing, do you fully know your characters before writing them into your story, or do they surprise you too in the process of writing?
Well, your subconscious knows things that you don't know. I don't plot or plan, so I never know what's going to show up. But I do believe that the subconscious is back there working all the time. It's probably plotting and planning, even if you're not consciously doing it or putting it on paper. But I never know what my characters are going to do. And that's one of the joys of writing for me. And it's the revelations that I get from telling the story that my subconscious says, well, that this, and I went, no, I didn't know that. That's cool. So yeah, it's very much, it's wonderful that way too, because you find more human elements in characters. You'll find somebody that he's not snidely whiplash. He believes in what he's doing. It's that old thing about everybody's a hero of their own story.
Mhm.
But it's probably more than that. It's more of all of us justify how we live our lives, and that includes people that we might think of as evil or on the wrong side of the fence.
Yeah, it's never simple.
Never.
Speaking of surprises, could you talk a little bit about how the elephant of surprise appeared in your work?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure a lot of people have said that when they talk about the element of surprise, and we always in the house we joke, "Oh, the elephant of surprise," and because and then Hap and Leonard talk about it being the big element of surprise is the elephant of surprise, and so they've used that in several books. But in this one, I just decided to call it Elephant of Surprise, and I remember that they didn't want me to call the book that because they didn't think people would understand it, and I thought, yeah, they will. They'll immediately get it. And if they don't, they'll be intrigued by it. So I was very happy to have called it The Elephant of Surprise. And I think that it's one of those titles that's, stuck, and a lot of people seem to appreciate it. But like I said, I try to write my books for me, and I try to pick the things that work for me. It's not that I don't listen to I don't show other people, there's a few friends down in would see something, but generally I don't care what other people think because I find that then you start worrying about it and you're not being yourself and you're not writing for yourself. You're trying to please these other readers. And if I want to have something in it that might embarrass Aunt Tilly, then I'd be worried about it, but I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not going to worry about those sort of things, And so you have to do that, whether it's titles or whether it's stories or what. But if my editor suggests something, I think it makes sense, I change it. And if I don't, then I don't. Or I modify it somewhere in between, depending on what level I think it is. And then my proofreader, they're the people that really affect me, come along and they'll ask questions. And sometimes, I don't agree with them at all. And it's go, stat, leave it be, Or they'll get hung up on something that makes no sense to me, or they'll have a problem with a Southernism or an East Texasism. And sometimes I look at it and go, well, maybe that's too far afield for somebody to understand, and unless they grew up in my house or something. And so then I might change it. Some things I leave in context, but mostly I try to keep it, the way I want it, the way I think people talk here, even though you're not really writing just how people talk, you're giving the illusion of how people talk.
So I have a customer and I can see he's here tonight. So he wanted me to ask you if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between Westerns and horror, since we're on the topic of local.
I'm sorry, the early what between them?
The relationship between Westerns and horror, because that
okay.
comes into play a lot in your books.
Yeah. I think, the first thing that really struck me with that when I was a kid, because they had a lot of horror Westerns, Dracula meets, Billy the Kid or something, or
right.
Jesse James' daughter meets Frankenstein. But there was, a whole kind of subculture of these at low budget films or drive-in theaters, and Curse of the Undead was one that was a favorite of mine. And so the very first weird Western I wrote was heavily influenced by Curse of the Undead. And that was Dead in the West. And also Robert E. Howard, who wrote a handful of weird Westerns, was another influence. And I was always a great fan of Westerns, and I liked horror too. So it, add all that together. In comics, when I was growing up in comics, it often blended weird Westerns, Westerns and horror. That was common. So I think all of those were, for me, almost natural. And I still do work in that field a little bit. And strangely enough, my son has an assignment to write a weird Western novella. He's also writes and sells screenplays and stories and things. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool, because when I was doing that, there was hardly anybody doing it. There were a few somewhat weird Westerns, like The Hawkline Monster by Richard Brodigan. And, I could probably, if I thought about it, name a handful. But when I did that, nobody was doing it. And now it's become like at least a subset genre.
Mhm.
I wouldn't say it's a big genre,
No,
but it's become a
niche.
subset genre. Some people influenced directly by me. Some people have no idea I ever wrote it. And, you know, but are influenced by me indirectly in the way that I was influenced by these things that, you know, led me to writing those. So in a sense, all of these people are coming from Howard and all these old movies and me. And then of course, you know, there have been weird Western stories all along. You know, when I was growing up, they used to tell me stories about the frontier, make hair on the back of your neck stand up.
Oh.
And my grandmother, you know, she grew up there. She was born in the 1880s. So when she was a girl and a young woman, she was living in the old West, you know, as it really was, not necessarily how we mythologize it.
And so now kind of moving over towards the horror side of things, because I came to you reading your horror when I first started reading Joe Lansdale. The Bottoms was like the first and foremost thing I read. And so ironically, Born for Trouble is the first Hap and Leonard book I have ever read.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, you're gonna like the novels. Then.
Now I'm gonna read
like
them all.
novels.
At one point I started reading Savage Season, but for some reason I just wasn't in the right place for it at the time. So
that happens.
So you know, so I'll just but still reading the horror was okay. I don't know why crime and horror have
right. If you've seen the TV show, the Hap and Leonard TV show, the first season is Savage Season.
Yeah. I've got a chance to watch the first episode or two. They did a great job.
Yeah,
so
right.
But
I like it.
But I do need to ask, as a horror fan, what was the first horror book that you read that really affected you? Do you remember?
The first one, my mother bought me a volume of Edgar Allan Poe. And that, you know, was not all horror, but it contained a lot of that. And some of the things that were non-horror had that atmospheric feel of horror. And then I had a book of Arthur Macon and Algernon Blackwood.
Okay.
They had their stories in it.
Yeah.
And those were the earliest ones that I remember. But then Rudyard Kipling, who wrote a few very good horror stories.
Yeah.
And Robert Louis Stevenson's, you know, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. And there were a lot of the classic things. And I didn't read Dracula until I was like 18 or 19. And I read Frankenstein before that and didn't like it when I was young. Read it later and really liked it, you know. But the first time I read it, I found it tedious, you know. But I read a lot of those, and I would read stories like The Upper Berth, individual stories that were in anthologies. Yeah, that one scares the hell out of me.
Yeah, that's a
and you know, then that led on to reading The Haunting of Hill House, and you know, and all the classics. You name them, I read them probably. And then of course there were elements of that in Macbeth and Hamlet, and so there were other things like that. There were a lot of science fiction films that had horrific elements, like the Thing from Outer Space or whatever it was. Yeah. The Thing was a big one for me, the original The Thing. And I like the remake a lot, but early on, that one especially got me. Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Oh, yeah.
Oh man, whoa, that jacked me around. That led me to reading the novel by Finney, and then I became a Jack Finney fan, and I read his other, you know, things which were mostly science fictional. So you know, it's like a process. One thing leads to the other. But a lot of the science fiction that I liked had horrific elements too. A lot of the stories that I liked.
Yeah. It's interesting how that happens. I think I've come to that same realization too. I love science fiction, but if it has that little bit of horror in it, right. Yeah. And
Edgar Rice Burroughs was my favorite when I was a kid because he was so inventive, and he's perfect for a 10 to 12-year-old boy, you know, maybe more than girls, more of a, you know, especially in that era. And I still have, he's still my sentimental favorite writer, but and he was so inventive, so imaginative, and he wrote with a first person narrative that was storytelling, and it was like you were there and this person was telling you that story. And I borrowed that as much as I was capable of from Burroughs. So that my first person narration, I tried to make it very much like, these are guys I know, or these are women I know, or these are people I know. And I don't always write in first person, but I frequently do. And that's wise, air ice burrows.
Oh, okay, that's really interesting because I always found reading your books, the voice of your characters pulls you right into the story. Like you're there with them, and
Thank you.
it
That's
really,
what I
really
learned from
works.
Burroughs, because I thought John Carter was real on some level. On some level, John Carter of Mars was convincing me that he was, a real person.
Yeah, that he was out there adventuring. Are there any of your stories that have been inspired by folklore that you grew up hearing about?
Oh yeah, lots of them. Yeah, the Bottoms. The novel has a lot of folklore about the Goat Man in it, and that wasn't just a legend that was East Texas, but a lot of through the South, especially, but elsewhere too. There's tales, and the Goat Man varies somewhat in how he's perceived and what he can do or what he can't do. But that was a legend in the Sabine River Bottoms when I was growing up.
Okay.
I never believed it, but it was very much when we go out camping, they talk about the Goat Man, and so that influenced it. And my grandmother told me a number of ghost stories that have gone into short stories, and my dad told me, a couple of things that were very realistic horror that I co-opted, and borrowed. And then I grew up seeing a lot of things that led to some of my more non-supernatural horror, like Night They Missed the Horror Show and things like that. Those were influenced by real life,
Yeah.
And they were presented humorously to me, almost like a Pecos Bill tale. But I'm listening to it, and there's a part of it's very funny, but there's another side of it that's just dark and dreadful. And it was instructive. Night They Missed the Horror Show in many ways is a morality tale. And people who look at it and go, it's horrible, or it has language that bothers me, they miss the point.
Yeah.
It's like Mark Twain. People go, Huckleberry Finn, they use a bad word. They miss the point. When I read Huckleberry Finn in the 60s, and I read To Kill a Mockingbird, they changed my life. They gave me a different perspective on civil rights, because I was just growing up in it. I wasn't thinking about it one way or the other because I was a kid. But when I read Mark Twain, especially in a vernacular that was not, too different from what I grew up hearing people say, and people's language was still very much of that era, and it was evolving through the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
I thought, yeah, I see what Twain's saying. I didn't know that it was satire or irony, but as I was reading it, I felt that. I understood that, even though I didn't know what it was called. And then when I got older, of course, I really appreciated it. Totally understood it. And I think that, you learn from reading, but in many ways, Twain is about real life horrors as well as funny things. And so I like those stories that mixed everything and dealt with all sorts of stuff. And that led to the Bottoms.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
just one, I've used that kind of folklorish element in a lot of.
Was there any of that in Moon Lake?
Yes. Oh, very much so.
Because that
Moon
was
Lake.
very haunting.
There've been several things where they covered lakes with, covered old villages and home areas with water. And my friend Wally Knight was telling me, and I can't remember where it was. But it was in Texas, and they flooded this old town like a lake, and people had moved out of it. It wasn't, they weren't there. But he said that you could go out on the lake and walk on the ceiling of like buildings, and he swam down. You could still see the structures. They weren't just like some of them were damaged, but some of them looked like you could go live in them.
Yeah.
And I remembered him telling me that, and I had heard similar stories prior to that. So it all kind of added together, and that became part of Moon Lake. And I'd also heard about people that would not move, and people thought they were gone, or at least decided they were gone. And it all led to some of the aspects of Moon Lake. And also, there were always stories about, in the Kill a Mockingbird, they talk about Boo Radley. But when I was growing up, you heard that all the time. That's a Southernism, not a Harper Leeism, is that there's always this one outsider, sometimes living in a house that nobody sees, sometimes out in the forest, sometimes on the riverbanks. And that outsider survives by his or her own wits, and that they are often dangerous because they don't want to be discovered. And so, you get all of these tales, and you get all of these stories, and and at least me, I'm influenced by all of them. And I'm really proud to bring a lot of that old material that's almost lost in some ways into books and into stories and in these morality tales, so that they'll survive.
Yeah, and I think, using them in morality tales, it sticks, because in a morality tale, you're thinking more about why things are happening, how they should be happening. And so it
Right.
really embeds that in you. So yeah,
Right.
that's an interesting point. So in your
you
writing,
you learn a lot and remember a lot more from fables and things like that than
Yeah.
you do from lectures.
Yeah, that is true. Nobody likes to be lectured at. And a fable engages you. It's not just
Yes.
telling you should or shouldn't. It's saying, here's what could happen. It's yeah,
Right.
it involves you in the story. You're not just being
Yeah.
told something. Yeah. That's
Right.
a
Well, I
good.
had all these Texas folklore and fables, but I also Aesop's fables and all those things, fractured fairy tales on Bullwinkle,
Yeah.
all that stuff. And animation was another big influence. All of that came into the mix.
So in your writing, there are obviously plenty of human monsters, and often also hints of other than human monsters. Which do you find more satisfying to write about? Possibly versus what's more fun to write about? Because satisfying and fun can be two different
The
things.
human monsters can be tough. The human monsters can be tough because you can get, a reader spends a few hours with it, but you're spending days or months with these characters, and it can wear you down. But I think I'm more satisfied dealing with the reality, because it's important to make some of the things that, I guess, some of the points I'm trying to make, and keep the reader, which is me, entertained while I'm writing it, which I hope then transfers to other readers. But those, I think I get a deeper satisfaction out of. But the others I love too, and sometimes the sort of supernatural. So I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't believe in life after death and any of that stuff. But I love the conceit of writing about it, and I love the conceit of believing it in my head in that moment in time, because that's how you make it convincing.
Yeah.
You have to believe everything you write about while you're writing about it.
Yeah, that would be pretty key. It works.
They're kind of like a holiday. My daughter and I wrote some stories that were very much in the old Carnacki Ghost Finder, tradition, called Terra Is Our Business. And they've been, I wrote 2 or 3 on my own, and then she and I wrote the story together with this character that we liked. And then we put these 2 characters together, and we changed the voice to that character, which was a more compelling voice than the one that I had used before, because I was really trying to do that kind of old-fashioned stiff, I'm at the club sort of story. But I had a female protagonist named Dana Roberts. And then Casey had a character named Jana. So had we known we were going to put them together, we wouldn't have had Dana and Jana, But when we put them together, they really came alive. And we've written 3 or 4 more stories like that. And they were published in a book called Terra Is Our Business, which is now out of print, which is now coming back into print, at least in a special edition from SST. Okay. And I think there's going to be a comic book series. There's film interest, and there will be a new release of the book in the future. And there are new stories. But those were so much fun because they were dealing with what Dana calls the super normal, meaning that they only call it a supernatural because they don't know it's real yet. They don't understand how it works. Yeah. And so that's it. But those are really like a holiday for me.
Okay. Yeah. that answers my question completely. So when you are writing about the human monsters, which, as you said, it can be a long process where you're immersed in that world and that mindset, how do you, when you're done with it, how do you pull yourself back out of those dark places?
It's funny that you say that. A friend of mine who's writing some dark stuff was really bothered by what he was doing. And he talked to me the other day, and I said, one way I look at it is that I've been on the sets with lots of actors and different things like that. And you have the method actors, a total immersion in the character. And then you have a lot of the British school is you learn it, but you're pretending. And I think that I believe that you want to, here's the thing. is actors in both schools, I think, give great performances. You know, I don't really believe that being method makes you better. I don't believe the other makes you better. But I think I'm more the kind of who I pretend. And when I get through, I'm able to walk away from it easier. I've had times when I was so immersed in doing dark stuff that I finally just said, I got to have a break. And that's when I would do something different or do something historical. And though those may have dark elements, they weren't dealing with that entire dark psyche. But for me, that's the way I can deal with it most of the time, is I'm not a method actor when I leave the work. I can walk away from it. But I feel very much into it while I'm doing it. But I never feel like those evil characters capture me, or even the good ones. I'm all of them. I'm part of them, but I can distinguish which of them are me.
Good. That sounds like probably the best approach for that, because
Right.
I think
it's healthier.
Yeah, because they have such a gravitation to them that if you're not careful, that can be a really slippery slope and hard to get
Yeah, you
back
know, I've
from.
known actors that said that they were really, you know, sort of knocked flat by writing really dark characters, and that they had a hard time coming out of, portraying really dark characters, and they had a hard time coming out of it, you know. And I've talked to writers who that are that way too. And for one thing is that I understand sensitivity and I feel it, and you know, I'm empathetic, but I'm also able to compartmentalize really well. That's something that I think I do well. That's one of my only powers. That and the ability to read fast. You know, and that's natural. I read fast and I have fairly good retention. But to me, is if you can't compartmentalize it, then you need to totally switch over and do something else. That's why sometimes you'll see writers in their career that write really dark stuff and then no more.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
doing something else. And I've always mixed it up, because I find if you take vacations and holidays away from it, you come back to it and you're enthused by it. This different exploration of your own psyche and your own interest. And a lot of that too is because I write what I want to write.
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably a good time to start moving over towards everybody's questions. We've got a little bit of
All right.
a row of them now.
Let's do it.
And anybody else who has questions, just pop them into the chat and we'll get to them as we scroll through. So Stephen has asked, he says he loves following along as Hap and Leonard age with, you know, their little occasions of scattered wisdom. And he wants to know which of the two, Hap or Leonard, have surprised you the most in how the character has grown and changed or developed?
They both have. It's really not one over the other. I relate more to Hap because it's first person and he's based on me in many ways. You know, I have a lot of the same background. I did the same crummy jobs that he did, most of them anyway. And, you know, I worked in the rose fields, aluminum chair factory, but a lot of things that he either does in the books or mentions in the books. I was an anti-war resistor. I almost went to prison. It was only by just a twist of fate that I did not. But I let Hap go and let that develop because I knew people who did go. And so I felt that was something to explore. After a certain point, I felt like that if I wasn't writing about the characters, I wouldn't age them. So if I left them at 40, they stayed at 40 till I came back. And if that was 8 years, 4 years or whatever, but I didn't try to catch up right where I left them as far as year went, but maybe as far as event went. I didn't worry about all that, you know?
Yeah.
And
just kind
so
of putting them on pause.
Yeah, I'm smarter, but they're younger. But you know, I think they both surprise me, but I think they have to change, and I think age changes them, and they've gone from barely surviving to being, I guess, what you would call lower middle class now. You know, they've got regular jobs, they make pretty good money. They have moments when it's not so good, which is pretty much lower middle class. You know, you have times when the car breaks down or somebody gets sick, and you know you're struggling for dollars. I mean, that's not uncommon. So I try to keep those elements in it. Hap eventually got married, you know, and discovered he had a daughter, so it gave him a different perspective on life and family. I think that you know, Leonard has probably mellowed a little, and he's found true love instead of all the bad choices he would always make. He would pick the worst people or the people that didn't jive with him the way he would have wanted. And so, they both surprise me and they delight me, and I will continue to age them. But like I say, they age more slowly. There may come a day when I write the novel and I say, that's it. They've reached that age when it's, they have to step back and step away. I've often thought about bringing his daughter Chance forward to do adventures.
Yeah.
I got to live a long time to do all this.
Maybe Casey can help you out.
Yeah, we've talked about it.
Shannon has asked if we will see Kason Statler again. Maybe Carson Statler.
He's been in a few of the Hap and Leonard novels in sort of like cameo roles. I don't know. I really liked Leather Maiden, but for some reason, Kason just sort of he has appearance in Hot in December. He is a prominent character in that little novella, and he's appeared, like I said, in some of the Hap and Leonard books. But for some reason, he just sort of deserted me as a main character. Maybe he'll come back. That happens.
Let's see. And Persu has asked about how lakes, rivers, and ponds are often in important roles in your stories. And he just read Moon Lake. Do you have any thing that you can comment about that?
Well, East Texas, like I say, is not like the rest of Texas. It like we've had rain for 2 days, and it rains all the time here. It's almost a tropical climate. And you have a lot of water, you have a lot of lakes, you have a lot of rivers, you have a lot of ponds. There's only one lake that's indigenous. All the others are man-made, but there are a lot of them, and certainly a lot of creeks and rivers and stuff. When I was growing up, that's what we did. We ran the creeks and rivers. So water unto itself is very much on my mind as a writer because this is my region, and it's like an artery. I think of it, as very much like arteries and veins that run through my stories. And I think it affects them because it's common to me. It's the same way in my books. I write a lot about weather, which for some writers say you should never do, but I totally disagree. If you do it well, I like to think I do it well. And weather to me is representational and metaphorical of a lot of different things. So water and weather.
Yeah, that's actually in Born for Trouble, the story where they try to go on vacation. The weather is a very big part in that. And you feel how the weather is affecting them. Like it's very present.
Yeah, it's also hot. It's muggy. It's not dry heat. There are no cactus. There are no mountains. There are no desert. It's trees and water and soft dirt. And it's a very, very different idea than you see in films.
Oh yeah. Texas does not, the general idea of Texas in those of us who live
and there are parts of Texas like that, but this isn't one of
them. We have a couple of questions in a row from Cliff and Marianne, who are wondering, Marianne wonders, is there any possible chance of a re-release of her beloved Bubba Hotep? She has an ancient Kindle.
The story?
She has an ancient Kindle copy, but
it's in print. It's in print in 2 locations.
Oh,
yeah, it's in print in the Best of Joe R. Lansdale, and it's in print with Bubba Hotep and the something bloodsuckers, cosmic bloodsuckers. Yeah, that's a prequel to Bubba Hotep, and then Bubba Hotep is also in that same volume.
Okay.
You get that through Book Voice. And then Tachyon Books has the Best of Joe R. Lansdale, which includes Bubba. Yeah.
Oh, excellent.
And it's out there a lot, actually. It's in a number of different, volumes. It's been reprinted and
she wanted her friends to be able to read it. So Marianne, there you go.
I think a good way to do that would be the Best of Joe R. Lansdale.
Then they get all the good stuff. Yeah. And Cliff asked if there were any chances of further adventures of Elvis.
Well, I did do that prequel. A lot of people don't know that. It was also made into a comic book series. And they also made a comic book series where the Evil Dead and Bubba crossed.
Oh, nice.
Where Elvis did it. but those weren't, they didn't get much play. But I wrote that prequel. I don't think I'll be writing any more about him. But you know, I never know. I never say never, because I never know what I'm going to do.
Yeah,
you know, I
they
usually
might
know
pop
kind
up.
of what's happening in short term, but not in long term.
Michael asks, well, he comments that it's hilarious when Hap and Leonard are riding around in their car listening to Casey Lansdale on the radio because they like her voice so much.
Inside joke. Yeah.
Did you tell Casey beforehand that you were going to do that, or was she
No.
surprised to find herself in the book?
I guess she was surprised. I didn't tell her. I mean, she knows it's in the book. So, and no, she was in the TV show. You know, she has in the second season, 5th episode, she appears in the background singing at a carnival, and then some her songs, a couple of her songs were used in the series, and a couple of them were used in Cold in July, or at least one was used in Cold in July, and so it's kind of a family thing, you know. And my son, like he and I worked on, we wrote a novel called Big Lizard, and he wrote Christmas with the Dead based on my short story, and he just did a film that he co-wrote called Pale Door, which is a weird Western, by the way.
Ooh, good.
You can see it on Shudder. It's on Shudder.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And you know, so I mean, our whole family's pretty much. My brother writes some too.
Yeah.
He's had a few. He wrote comics and books, and he and I wrote some comics together, and we wrote one book together, Hell's Bounty.
Yeah.
You know, my wife wrote 2 short stories with me and co-edited Dark at Heart, which was an anthology that we did. She did most of the work, I must admit. And then she founded the Horror Writers of America. A lot of people don't know that.
I didn't know that.
Different people get, yeah. Rick McCammon came up with the idea, but he didn't want to do it. So my wife, it's called HOWL then, Horror Occult Writers League. And my wife said, look, I'll do it. So she did all the work, put it together, and she was even Xeroxing and stapling up stuff. It was that far back and sending it out, and it created the organization. They put it together. They got, you know, officers and got it going. And then Dean Koontz said, look, I'll put some money into it and make it more professional. So he paid for like newsletters to become more professional and stuff like that. And my wife has a Richard Lehman Award for her contributions to that.
I saw that, but I didn't know what it was for.
She never gets the credit that she deserves.
Yeah.
She's quiet. She doesn't talk about it much. She doesn't say anything, but if there would be no Horror Writers Association, and it was Horror Writers of America, and it was HOWL at one time, had it not been for her.
Well, Karen is a woman who gets things done, apparently. That's awesome. That's really cool.
She managed my career, and Casey's, Casey started singing when she was 17. So she's been doing that all her life, and Karen managed her career, that part of it, the money and all that stuff up to a certain point, and has managed mine up until the last few years, when now we have accountants and agents, and it's not as simple as it used to be, but I'm not complaining,
So Marianne says, thanks for the information about where to find Bubba Hotep. She's excited to find versions that aren't stupidly expensive. So she's going to go look for it. Peter wonders, he recently found Westerns through your writing. And he wonders, who are some of your favorite Western authors?
Oh, wow. Glendon Swarthout, and he wrote a lot of things that weren't Westerns, but he wrote The Shootist, he wrote The Homesman, for example, 2 of my favorite Westerns, and he certainly touched on Western themes. Yeah, he wrote They Came to Cordova, another Western. I think, who was that? Was Gary Cooper was in it. It goes back that far. And he wrote things like Bless the Beast and the Children, Where the Boys Are. All of these things. I mean, those are the writers that influenced me, the people who could write anything and like to write different stuff and like to explore different ideas. But he's a favorite Western writer of mine. McMurtry, when he was writing Westerns, with some of his later Westerns I didn't care for, but Lonesome Dove certainly, and Comanche Moon certainly. I thought those were just fantastic Westerns. And I think The Last Picture Show is kind of a late Western in some ways. Yeah. And certainly Hood, or Horseman Pass By, as it's sometimes known. So McMurtry, those come to mind. Elmer Kelton, amazing Western writer. The Time It Never Rained is probably one of the great novels of the United States, for that matter. It's a great American novel, as is Lonesome Dove, you know.
Yeah.
So those are some. I mean, you don't want to get me started on this because I have a long list. It's funny, and Elmore Leonard wrote a lot of westerns before he wrote crime. The Hombre is one of my very favorites, and Valdez is coming. You know, and he wrote others, Gun Sights and whatever, but those two I think are primo. You know, and I almost sometimes think, I was talking to my son, I sometimes think westerns might be what I like best. You know, people always ask me what you like best, and I always go, I don't really have a best, but I get pretty enthused when we talk about westerns.
That's awesome. That's great. I'm going to look at the
I've written a few of them. Yeah,
I know. And I'm going to look at the Western shelf at my shop a little differently now and see if I
try
because I know I have
the Thicket.
Yeah, the Thicket I liked. Yeah, I think the Thicket
Paradise Sky.
Thicket.
Paradise Sky is my favorite book.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
The Thicket and the Magic Wagon were I think the first two Westerns I ever read. So
right. And I wrote some shorter pieces like Black Hat Jack and Radiant Apples, and the Magic Wagon, of course, was my first one early on.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a good little story.
But that'll give them a few Western writers to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Massimiliano asks, when is Born for Trouble going to be released in Italian? And he also says, I loved Jane Goes North. Who inspired the main character? So 2 questions from Massimiliano.
Jane Goes North. Really, I'm not going to say the name of the person that inspired it. She's deceased now, but certainly it was a combination of people, really. But there was one person that I had in mind for much of it, you know, not that they were twins, you know, or anything, but just and also just, you know, people I've known in general, and they were people who I think of as life's innocents. You know, they're not bad people. They're not particularly, you know, out. What would you say? They wouldn't be thought of as intellectuals. They wouldn't be changing the world, but they're living their life and they're doing it the best they can under their circumstances. And I just thought, here we have 2 people that are trying to do a simple thing, and that's go to the Boston area from the South, and everything goes wrong. And it's also a traditional road novel with women. Yeah. Some people said Thelma and Louise, which I love that movie, but I don't know that had much influence, but I can see connections because it's 2 people on the road. Yeah. I think mine's a whole hell of a lot funnier. I think it's a different approach to it, but it's not one person, but one person in particular I did have in mind for a lot of it.
Do you know when Born for Trouble will be released in Italian, or is that still?
Oh, I do not. I think that it will be released in Italy. It's Hap and Leonard, so my agent would do that. A lot of people ask me questions I don't know the answer to because I don't market my books. Yeah. I have somebody to do that for me. And so sometimes I don't know. And even sometimes if I sign contracts, I don't know because I forget over a period of time because I got so much going on. I try not to let myself get caught up in that. And so then, you know, I'm always happily surprised.
Well, hopefully Massimiliano will be happily surprised too.
I think it's coming out there though. I do believe that I believe that I was told that it is coming out.
Yeah, they'll be excited, I'm sure, because it's a terrific collection. Marianne has added an update. She just bought 2 copies. So now her friends can read Bubba Hotep. So happiness all around.
Thank you.
Patrick says there was no one better to play Leonard than Michael Kenneth Williams. And he wanted to know if you got a chance to meet him and what was he like if you did?
Yeah, I was on the set most of the entire first season, you know, and I visited the set on the 3rd season. I was banned from the set in the 2nd season because I didn't agree with some of the stuff they do. But they ended up doing what I wanted anyway, if for no other reason than accident, you know. And James Purefoy stuck with me. He had my back. But I really thought the world of the cast in the first season. I mean, James Purefoy and Michael and you know, Christina Hendricks and Neil Sandilands and my buddy Bill Sage and Jeff Pope, and I'm sure I'm going to leave somebody out, but I loved all Polly McIntosh, who played Angel, and Jimmy. I mean, they were just fantastic, and they were all great to be around. I enjoyed being there. Michael was a very nice and interesting guy, but he had demons, and he admitted to them. I mean, he was no secret. I'm not talking out of school. He often talked about his addiction problem, and that that he was working on that, and obviously he lost that battle. But he was a great actor, and I miss him. We weren't dear friends, but we were friendly on the set, and occasionally we'd exchange an email. James and I are a little closer, but it's painful. It's painful.
Yeah, it's a regular human tragedy that a lot of people have friends and family dealing with. So it's important to bring it out there and let everybody know it's not something to hide. It's part of life for a lot of people. So well, it looks like we have answered. Oh, wait, I spoke too soon.
One more.
Got one more. Massimiliano says thank you. He will wait for the Italian release.
Okay,
and then Peter asks, what inspired you to create the Ned the Seal stories?
Wow, those were really off the wall. I what's weird is I always thought of them as in claymation, and when I was growing up, I would see claymation, as part of the kids shows and things like that. But I guess Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and comic books and the sort of off-center underground comics of the 70s, probably, especially the early 70s, probably influenced the thinking, but there were so many different sort of bizarre offbeat stories and books that gave me this idea to enter into this world of Verne and Wells and Burroughs and all of these, classic science fiction writers. So I think I was playing with that. I think I was really looking at that both as a love letter and as a satire.
And Dennis has a question. Is there anything that you've read recently that you'd recommend?
Yeah, there's a nonfiction book about Daniel Boone and about the forming of the United States, really, and about how it affected Native Americans and how it deals with Europe and in the 1700s. When all this was happening. It's called Blood and Treasure by Thomas Clavin and Bob. I can't remember. It's by the other fellow. I don't remember. I've read other books by Tom Clavin, so I remember his name. But for nonfiction books, I recommend that. And then novels, a children's Bible is, and it's not a Bible. It's a apocalyptic story about the end of the world by Tilly Liddon, I think. I could have that name wrong, but I highly recommend that. It's very funny. It's a funny apocalyptic story, and I laughed out loud, and it's extremely well written. It was a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize.
Oh, geez. Okay.
A finalist,
probably know about that.
Finalist for the Pulitzer Prize.
Excellent. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. There are a number of people who in the chat are saying thank you. Thank you. This has been a real thrill.
Thank you. Thank all of you. I appreciate it.
So it was really great to talk to you again, even though we were many miles apart this time.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Maybe we'll have to bring you back up to Maine sometime.
I hope so.
Awesome. Well,
good night.
Thank you so much, Joe. And I hope everybody picks up a copy of Born for Trouble and reads it, because it is a fantastic ride. It's really, really good. And lots of short story adventures with Hap and Leonard. So thank you, everybody. Have a great night, Joe. Thank you.